This video is for reading 8 and it's entitled The Invention of Heterosexuality, and it's written by Jonathan Katz. So it starts off by basically saying our perception of heterosexuality is inaccurate. And they say that, the author says that we tend to think about the concept of heterosexuality as being, old as procreation, as ancient as the lust of Eve and Adam. Um, and he was like, but in actuality, we haven't always thought about sexual identity or sexual behavior by using this type of terminology. Heterosexuality is actually a modern invention, and the objective of this reading is to locate and study the concept of heterosexuality in history. So, when did it come about? When did we start using it, and how and why? And the author notes that's because studying the history of the term challenges its power, right? Instead of thinking about it in terms of it being normative or, the way it always was, it wasn't the way it always was. So, understanding the social historical context in which it comes about and how it's been utilized means that maybe we would stop thinking about it as being like a natural term, something that just has always existed, and instead kind of start to see it for what it is, right? A socially constructed identity label. Before we actually delve into the reading, let's just, look at the sociological background slides on sexuality. So, to study the concept of sexuality, some sociologists focus on identities, and this largely has to do with the identification. With sex categories and sexual orientation. And just as gender identity falls along a broad spectrum, so does sexual orientations. And our identity and our biology are the building blocks of sexual behavior, which creates the social reality of the sexuality that we see around us. So, sexual orientation itself, although is related to sexual identity, is not the same as sexual behavior. And that's because people who don't identify as gay or lesbian have sexual relationships with people of the same sex. So, just because they don't claim that sexual identity does not mean that they have never and don't ever engage in the sexual behavior that we correlate with that identity. So, specifically, what is sexual orientation? Well, it's the pattern of romantic or sexual attraction to others in relation to one's gender identity. And as already noted, it exists on a continuum that ranges from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. Heterosexual meaning that, is what we would consider straight. Homosexual is, gay, or sometimes referred to as lesbian for women only. And as the definition notes, it's also kind of it's defined by your own gender identity as well. So with heterosexuality, we say that you are sexually attracted to and engage in sexual relations with someone that has the opposite gender identity as you, while homosexuality, you engage in sexual behaviors and have sexual attraction for people who have the same identity as you. Bisexuality is a little less widely recognized, but it is someone that is sexually attracted to people who both share and do not share their gender identity. And there is a phenomenon called bisexual erasure, and that's because people who identify as bisexual can sometimes find themselves excluded from both straight and gay communities, and especially if they are with a partner of the opposite, you know, sex. Instead of being recognized as bisexual, they oftentimes are just perceived as being heterosexual. A variation on bisexuality in the sense that, it's not a recognized, it's a less recognizable label, is pansexuality. And this is the label that's meant to try to address the fact that, gender identity isn't binary, because our traditional sexual orientation labels are really built upon and predicated upon this idea that someone can be the opposite sex of you or the same sex as you. And so it's a very binary way of looking at gender identity. And then a small percentage of people have no sexual attraction to people of either of any gender, and they may adopt an asexual identity. And this is an emerging category of sexual identity because traditionally, not experiencing sexual attraction was seen as being a disorder. And people who claim the identity of asexual are pushing back against that labeling of themselves as having a disorder. Um, we don't have a lot of survey research, large scale surveys on sexual orientation is relatively new. But based on what we do have in sociology, it's been found that sexual orientation as an identity is not a fixed quality that people have. These identities can be fluid and they can change over time. And in terms of behavior, as we've already noted, there are people who engage in sexual behaviors that we might label, them as being part of part of the homosexual or bisexual community, but they themselves don't actually claim that identity. Same gender sexual attraction and behavior occur more commonly among women than among men, and this has grown with time. Um, and trying to use this data to determine the number of people in society who are homosexual is difficult because once again the question becomes, do we honor how people self-identify, or do we label people based upon their behavior? It is worth noting that exclusively homosexual behavior and identity occurs in roughly about 5 to 6% of American adults. So returning to the reading, um, returning to the reading this way. This reading is pretty clear in the sense that it kind of breaks down these historical time periods and how love and sexuality are being treated and perceived and defined during that time period. Because a lot of this is history and not sociology. Although, of course, it's important in sociology that we have this socio-historical context. I don't have a lot to add outside of the reading. So I'm not going to go over a lot of this in a lot of detail because really it's just important that you read. But I'm just going to kind of hit some of the themes. So the time period that they call before heterosexuality, they split in two time periods. The first time period, early Victorian true love. And they really just emphasize there is this focus here on purity. Women are supposed to be naturally pure, men are supposed to be aspiring to purity. And sex is really just not discussed. It's kind of perceived as being for procreation and only within marriage. There's very little focus on lust. So of course, there's not going to be any focus on whether that lust occurs in a same-sex or partnership or not. As we move into the later Victorian time period, there is a shift towards eroticization and a shift towards society being more interested in eros and lust. And your book talks about it very clearly about how this is related to the growth of the consumer economy and the fact that families become, instead of sites of production, which they largely were during the agrarian era where a lot of families were involved in farming, to now being sites of consumption, because now you have families where they're primarily being supported by wage labor and they're not producing their own goods, they're taking their wages and buying those goods. And so this leads to a consumer culture, and at least part of that consumer culture begins to touch on sex. The other kind of social factor is there is a rise of doctors, their prominence, their social status, and they begin to kind of talk about what it means to have a healthy sexuality. And so your book talks about on page 91 how this like model of normal love becomes kind of the modern medical alternative to the cult of true love that existed in the earlier time period that was the domain of ministers more so than doctors. Then we discuss, heterosexuality, the early years. The first known use of the term occurs in a medical journal in 1892 by Dr. Kiernan. But it's worth noting that how Kiernan, how he defines what heterosexuality is not in keeping with how we currently define it. He talks about it in terms of people who have physical hermaphroditism, and they basically so the opposite sex had to do with like them having like traits of both sexes internally, and of course that's not how we discuss heterosexuality today. But that same year, a doctor out of Germany had his text published in the United States, and his definition is more in keeping with today's. And it's just worth noting the fact that his definition also kind of just focused on sexual desire and sexual interest, also broke with the norm that sexuality only existed or only needed to be discussed in reference to procreation. And so during this time period, other doctors basically start to embrace this definition and adopt this idea that normalized heterosex. And so when we get to the 1900 and 1930s, during this time, heterosexuality has become the ruling sexual orthodoxy. And although it is still strongly being connected to the human drive or need to procreate, there also starts to be just some discussion about just it is healthy to have sexual desire and have sexuality outside of procreation. And so this definitely represented a pushback against that old, purity norm that dominated during the early Victorian true love period. And the fact that, that a discussion of sexuality and healthy sexuality outside of procreation was even being had in relation to women is really important because, of course, during that time period, although purity was kind of, all aspects of society was kind of characterized by this focus on purity, it was most closely linked and most closely correlated to women. 1930 to 1945, the term heterosexuality now is becoming more widely used outside of just medical academic sources. And the reading gives, for example, a New York Times article. 1945 to 1965, we see the rise of the cult of domesticity post World War II. So the rise of that traditional breadwinner father, stay at home mother, just really entrenched traditional gender norms. And so the hetero norm largely goes unchallenged during this time period. And furthermore, your book notes the conservatives at this time reassert that old link between heterosexuality and procreation, which your book kind of, sums up as feminine females and masculine males need to be prolific breeders. So perhaps it's unsurprising that the baby boom, it is the result of this kind of cultural shift. But as we start to get into the 60s, we do start to see the ascendancy of sex liberalism, more liberal ideas taking hold about sexuality and sexual behavior. And they focus on the work of Dr. Alfred Kinsey in particular, and some of his more important claims. So before kind of highlighting some of those claims, let me just go to my slide on Alfred Kinsey. His research was conducted in the 1940s and 1950s. His book comes out in the 1950s, 1960s, and it is, at the time, it is considered to be very controversial, because he proposes that, instead of treating heterosexuality and homosexuality as these discrete categories, it's really a continuum. And he suggests that a lot more people are engaging in same-sex behavior, but not necessarily identifying as homosexuals. And for this reason, it can be very difficult to measure sexual identity. And your book makes that point, on page 94, that, he contests the idea of there being a either or antithesis between hetero and homo persons. And he denied that human beings are two discrete populations, heterosexual and homosexual. Instead, he says that, this is a continuum and it's hard to build social identities around a continuum. And so your book kind of discusses on page 94 and 95 the positives and negatives associated with the social construction of the hetero-homo social identity division. And, on one hand, it gives people a social identity to kind of, create cohesion and rally around. But on the other hand, like Kinsey says, it really narrows and obscures the realities about sexual behavior and sexuality in the country. And so when we get to 1965 and 1982, they just kind of point, at this point, there's now just a lot of critique and a lot of questioning about a lot of things, about traditional gender norms and how they relate to sexuality, about the orthodoxy of heterosexuality. There's just this critique around sexual repression that kind of comes out of the 60s. And so the authors end the piece by really just kind of emphasizing that, there is a distinction between naming something and labeling it and creating an identity around it, as opposed to experiencing it and people engaging in these behaviors. So people had these experiences, engaged in these behaviors long before we created, names and labels for it. But yet, obviously, once we create names and labels for something, this is a really important kind of development, because it means that we now have a mode of organization, a social organization, and a way of kind of describing and understanding our experiences. Um, and so this therefore then kind of shapes the experiences themselves. Studying this concept historically helps us see that there has always been historical diversity of social sexual emotions and behaviors. This isn't just newfangled things that are happening, in the new millennia. And so on page 97, when they say that a historical view of heterosexuality requires us to look carefully at the relations between a society's organization of eros and pleasure, a society's mode of engendering persons as feminine or masculine, a society's ordering of human reproduction, and its dominant political economy. So it really just encourages to think about the ways in which sexuality and sexual behavior are socially constructed and socially organized. And it emphasizes that if we take this view, it will allow us to ask new questions about human sexuality, right? As opposed, because we will no longer just be taking things for granted based on what we think we may know about the topic. So the questions I encourage you to consider based on the reading: why do you think it's helpful to consider the historical roots in the context of language, particularly identity terms? Can you think of some more recent terms related to sexual behavior and identity? We're engaging in a similar analysis of what led to their development. Social forces, cultural shifts, research, arts would be useful.